Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Family Session A. My name is Tamara Kleinschmidt, and I'll be your moderator this morning, and I'm very pleased to be here. Before we get started with the speakers, there are a couple of housekeeping notes. If you are having issues with your stream quality, please click on the Click Here switch to alternate stream. That button is below the video player, so you should be able to access that. If you're having other technical issues, click the help button at the top menu on the page, and you can send a help request to the technical team, and a response will be emailed to you. So I guess we'll jump right into it right now. I'd like to present our first speaker. First presenter is Dr. Marg Rogers, and she is presenting Young Children's Understanding of Parental Deployment and Training.
Hi, resourcing and supporting young children's understanding of parental deployment within an Australian Defence Force ADF family. My name's Dr. Marg Rogers, and I'm at the University of New England in Australia. And I haven't got any commercial interest, but I have got a grant since I did my PhD, and that's with the Potter Foundation, University of New England, and the Foundation of Graduates of Early Childhood Studies. So I don't have any commercial, but I do have the grants that I mentioned previously. And my PhD findings were not funded, and I'm not making profits from the project that I talk about later in the presentation. So the learning objectives today are to explore the understandings of young children, 2 to 5 years, and of their parents' military deployment. I also want to look at how age and culturally appropriate resources can support young children's understanding of military family life. And I'd like to explore how research-based free online resources are being created and trialled in Australia. Here's a list of my references. So prior to when I did my PhD in 2013 was my data collection, and I finalised in 2017. Very little Australian research had been done with military families. Previous research had used a deficit psychological approach and relied on secondary data. So, for example, they would ask the parents how they were dealing with deployment, and it was often looking at a time in previous times. So it was well past when the deployment happened, when those questions were being asked to families. So since my PhD, some further studies have been done with education liaison officers in schools, and the Australian Institute of Family Studies are also now engaged with a study of ADF families, and some of the initial findings have been published since that time. So the methodology I used to work with children, because I was the first Australian research to actually work with young children of defence families, and to look at their understandings and their experiences. So my research question was, what are young children's understandings and experiences of parental deployment within an Australian Defence Force family? Now, to do that, to research with very young children, it's quite different. Obviously, they don't write essays, and often they don't talk in paragraphs, although some of them do. But I used a participatory research approach, a qualitative research approach, and it's called the Mosaic Approach. And basically, I've got some photos of a mosaic there. So in the bottom picture, you can see a very clear picture and a pattern. But if you look at the first picture there, it's a small portion of that. And with mosaic research, it's basically taking tiny pieces of data, just like in a mosaic picture, it's tiny pieces of colour or tiny pots of colour. And then what the researcher does with those tiny pieces of data is they piece them together, they take a little step back, have a think about the patterns that are emerging. So there you can see a leaf type shape pattern. And then once those are sort of cross-checked with other pieces of data, the researcher can step back and find a picture there. So I worked I created 6 case studies of 6 children, but I started with 17 children from 11 families. So it's a lot of data because for the 6 case study children, I was actually working with them every day, 5 days a week for a month. So it was a long time, a lot of data, a lot of pieces of data. And then it was thematic analysis that I used. And it involved children from 4 different bases, military bases, in 3 geographic states in Australia. Parents were also involved to cross-check and to provide data themselves, and also early childhood educators, some of them were involved as well. So one of the findings was that there was a lack of age and culturally appropriate resources. So when I mean age appropriate, so rather than primary school resources or elementary school resources, they were actually early childhood resources. There was a real lack of those in Australia. There was also a lack of culturally appropriate resources. So parents had gone and tried to source resources from elsewhere, usually the US, and they found those quite frustrating, even though they were good resources, but they weren't culturally appropriate. They had different uniforms, different flags, different expressions, different ways of expressing some of the parts of military life, and they also sort of had a different culture behind them than what defence culture in Australia is like. So parents asked me, and so did educators, for me to make some resources for the children. So they also saw that what I was doing with the children day after day, they called that a program, even though it was research and I had never called it a program. They called it that, and they said, we want you to take that program, that what you're doing with the children, around to different early childhood services to help families. This has been really helpful for our children. Having a month with you meant that they're less whiny, they're less clingy, and they're not crying as much, and they're able to finally verbalise what it is that's upsetting them when their parents deployed. They're able to come up with those words and explain what's happening for them. So down the bottom of each of these, I've got little pieces of data that I talked about in that Mosaic approach. So here we've got a child who is playing and doing a role play from one of the stories that I had created. So when parents said that there was a lack of resources, they actually said they felt really unsupported, and they felt like the Defence Forces or the military forces were not supporting them, and they felt really isolated, and they felt really disappointed, let down, and a little bit bitter about the fact that they were giving so much to the military indirectly through being part of it in their family, but yet the military weren't doing anything for them, and they felt like they'd been let down. Some parents had access, as I said, the US apps and some books, but they just found them inappropriate in many ways. And educators had also found that the Defence Community Organisation, or Defence Member and Family Support that they're now called, had put together some quite good primary school or elementary school resources for older children who were at school, but they felt that the early childhood area was something that had been missed. So when I first started interviewing parents for the in the project, I decided what I would start to do is to write some of their stories down, and they asked me to help them write some children's books just as a charity thing. I wasn't going to get paid for it, no royalties involved, just to help the children understand what was happening when their parent went away, whether it was for training or deployment, because the children were having difficulty understanding some of those difficult concepts about a parent being away out of the house for a long time and then coming back, and how deployment was different than when they just went to work at the base, they came home each night. And those issues were having major effects in their family life, and they're very disruptive to the children. The transitioning of the parent in and out of the household was also problematic. So I wrote some stories. I just put them on Google Slides. There was nothing terribly professional about the look of the books. They were just ebooks, and I used them with the families, which they were really happy about. So they had defence families in the military families, and the children were the stars of these. Now, when I wrote them, they were just for those families. But then I asked them permission if I could use those when I went on data collection to an early childhood service for a month that I talked about previously, and they were more than happy. They said anything we can do that would help other military families. So these became a source of elicitation. So I would read one of these stories, and then that would form discussions with the children. We'd do puppet plays and art activities and craft and raps and role plays. And then that would in turn create these little pieces of data that I was talking about. I also provided on a memory stick some of the books that I'd written, because I'd written about 9 of them by then, and they read them at home, and then they would tell me the children's responses. So it was, they were research-based, and they were created from data, but then they created data in themselves, which was really quite interesting. So the results were that once I used the thematical approach and I applied a socio-ecological lens that Bronfenbrenner had created, there were 2 categories of results. There were children's experiences of parental deployment, and there were children's understandings. And the focus of this presentation is about their understandings. So children were also allowed to have a disposable camera, and then they took photos of what deployment meant for them. And they could get the parent to also do that. And here we have a father who's going away to Afghanistan, and he's talking about where he's going to go to his 2.5-year-old child, and marking it on the globe in reference to Australia. And he would do this little routine every night for a few weeks before he left. The general findings, there were many findings in the PhD, but I'm just focusing on a very small section of them here tonight. So basically, the children's understandings meant that they changed over time, and they were influenced by acculturation and narrative. And what I mean by narrative is what the parents told them. So the parent would tell the child a very small story, just an age-appropriate story, like Daddy's going to Afghanistan, and then Daddy's going on a plane, and then Daddy will come back at Christmas time, or Daddy will come back at Easter time, or on Maddie's birthday, or something like that. And these little narratives helped the children to understand what was happening. And these were reinforced. So they were reinforced by the parent when the child tried to repeat them, and they were reinforced by older siblings. They were also reinforced, interestingly, by early childhood educators. And they also, overall, the understandings of the children were influenced by the child's development. So as the child got older, they were able to understand a bit more. Here's another piece of data, and this is what a 5-year-old child did to say what their face looked like when their father went on deployment. And they said that the tears were blue. This is their face. So, importantly, young children's understandings can be enhanced with the use of age and culturally appropriate resources. The parents found that the resources were really useful. And they also meant that the resources, the storybooks, were able to be touch points, or they were able to be starting points for this discussion about difficult issues and transitions happening in the home that were hard to understand. So it meant that the parents had a starting point with these discussions. So from there, after my PhD, I got together a team of researchers, and then we got some funding, and we were able to get enough funding to be able to create professional versions with graphic illustrators of some of these storybooks. I was able to write more storybooks when I was on data collection and use graphic illustrators and make some of them interactive. So, and then I was able to make an app. I was also able to do some puzzles and some board games and some puppets for parents to use, all free, of course, because of the funding, and also to create research-based modules using experts from a steering committee to write modules to assist the parents with helping their children build resilience from a strengths-based, resilience-based framework. So these are called the Early Childhood Defence Programs Project, and it's currently being evaluated using control trials, and it's planned to be released in the public domain. You can look at the information about the project there, and it will be eventually released, and it will all be free to the public. So that's my presentation. Thank you.
Sorry, I have to get used to unmuting again. Thank you very much. That was rather inspiring, particularly since I come from a center, one of the family resource centers that we do have an early years program embedded in our center. So how very applicable I can see that research being. So thank you for that. There are a couple of questions that I'll ask. And the first one is, how have stakeholders been engaged in creating the new resources?
Okay, thanks. Yeah, initially what happened was we set up a website for the project, and then we used social media to get the message out that this project was going to happen. We asked for their ideas, what types of resources they would like for young children, and also what content they wanted as well. After that, we formed a steering committee, and they've been instrumental to us. They've connected us with people in other stakeholders, but they've also offered us advice for content, but also with the way the project should go. They've offered encouragement, feedback, and they've also helped author some of the resources for parents, educators and family and social workers. They've also been instrumental in helping with some of the children's resources as well. They've helped recruit people for the control trials, and they've also helped us apply for further funding, which we've received some extra funding for extra resources. So they've really been instrumental the whole way through.
That's wonderful. Can you give us an idea of what has been the reaction to the new resources, especially like during the control trial?
Yeah, so we're just in the initial stages. So we have had just some quick emails to say thank you so much for doing this. I really wish I had this for my younger children, or I wish I had this, 10, 15 years ago when I was working with younger children. So that's been really encouraging. They're saying we're hitting the spot with what's there. They've also given us some tips and said, different things about the layout of the resources on the learning management platform. And so we've been able to take that on board and start changing things when we've swapped over groups within the control trial. So it's going well so far. It's a long sort of 18-month trial with different groups starting at different times. So yeah, it's been initially very good.
That's wonderful. With the tools that you're creating, I'm wondering, you mentioned that the cultural differences really did play a role, and often we see that the difference between Canadian and American as well. So what do you think? So if we took the aspects that you've learned, each military or each country would have to adapt for those cultural differences. Do you think that that's an important lesson to be learned from all of this?
I do. I think that the children, when they're looking at resources, or the parents, they need to see themselves somehow reflected. They need to think, yes, that's my family, but it's a bit different, or that's my experiences, but slightly different. If they can't see themselves in the resources, it's very hard for them to make that connection. And I think they feel a little bit left out of the children's literature, certainly in Australia. They feel a little bit left out in the resources that are available for families. If they can't see themselves, or they've always got to rely on resources, however good they are, if they're relying on them from another country, they can't quite make that connection. So I think it's really important.
That's excellent. A question that has popped up is, what proportion of deploying members were male versus female, and how did that impact, or how did it vary based on that?
This is for the control trials, I'm presuming.
Mm-hmm. I'm assuming.
Yeah. So at the moment, we have ethics approved to work with the civilian parent, so the non-defence or non-military member, and we're still applying for military ethics to work with the defence parent. So it's quite different, and that's nearly there with the ethics application. So we will, I think, get a different gender balance, but at the moment it's predominantly female that are involved in the control trial as a partner, but that I think will change. We will get more males involved in the control trials once this military ethics is approved at a later date.
So did the male versus female kind of reflect the general spousal demographic, or was it just easier to recruit female spouses?
It was easy to recruit. I think it got passed around on social media. I think that we have a social media group that's really popular with female partners of defence members or military members. So I think it was the way it was advertised, and we tended to get far more. So I don't think it's representative of the demographic in a true sense, but I think it was just who was available at the time. But as I said, hopefully we get that balance when we get the military ethics through.
So wonderful. Thank you very much for joining us. We really appreciate it, and certainly have some very fundamental food for thought to take away. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
So we're about to move on to our next speaker, who is Limor Zetrenblatt, presenting the contribution of mutual perceived support to the marital satisfaction of combat commander couples. And I'll just remind you at this point that there will be no question and answer at the end of this, and we will move straight into our break.
Hi, my name is Limor. I'm a PhD candidate at Bar-Ilan University in Israel. Up until 6 years ago, I was a mental health officer in the Israeli Defense Forces, the IDF. I was in charge of a unit that provided consultation and psychotherapy for military commanders and their families on the basis of the fact that serving in the army is a stressful situation. My study examines the contribution of perceived support to marital satisfaction of combat commanders couples. This study was carried out through a research grant from the Medical Corps, the Israeli Defense Forces, the IDF, and the Director of Research, Development of Weapons and Technological Infrastructure, MAPAT, Ministry of Defense, Israel. No commercial support to disclosure, And this study is an independent study that has received approval from the IDF Medical Corps, and there is no conflict of interest. No potential bias to mitigate. And my learning objectives are to understand the challenges of Israeli combat commander couples in Israel and to discuss the perceived support and its contribution to marital satisfaction among Israeli combat commander couples by using dyadic analysis, the APIM, the Actor-Partner Independence Model. And these are my main references that I used in my study. The army and the family are two greedy institutions that demand an exclusive loyalty of the individual to them, each of which imposes on the individual a system of pressures and demands that often contradict each other. On one hand is the military organization. It's one of the most demanding institutions since it places unique demands on its members and their families. And on the other hand, the family. The family system has many expectations of her members. But let me first describe shortly the uniqueness of the combat commander in the IDF. As Israel has been under ongoing security threat for approximately 70 years, individuals are obliged to enlist to the army at the age of 18, meaning that combat commanders are actually in ongoing service from this age. It's of course a mandatory army recruitment when everybody is serving the People's Army. The combat commander is not deployed overseas, but close to home, and he comes home every other weekend. The service conditions of the combat commander are difficult. They change position every 18 to 24 months. They have to cope with physical challenges involved in round-the-clock combat activity, which require a high level of physical fitness. Let's remember that these men are in their mid-30s, while the majority of the soldiers are young, even under 20. As mentioned, the security threat causes lots of emergency situations. But more than any other characteristic, as opposed to any other occupation, is exposing the combat commander to the possibility of injury, life-threatening injury, or even death. Their wives have to deal with uncertainty and concern for their partner's safety, and with most of the tasks involved in home care and children needs. The aims of this study are to examine the differences in the level of marital satisfaction and perceived support among Israeli combat commanders and their spouses, and to examine the contribution of perceived support to marital satisfaction by using the dyadic analysis applying the actor-partner independence model, as I mentioned before. But what is perceived support? So first of all, what is social support? Social support is a multidimensional resource that includes different types of support that can be provided by different agents of support. The types of support can be emotional, cognitive, instrumental, and the agent of support can be spouses, like in this study, or family, friends, and spiritual or religious belief. Perceived support is a subcontrast of social support. It assesses the recipient perception concerning the availability of support and takes into account the satisfaction with the support that is perceived to have been provided. As such, it is subjected to the recipient impression of it. The sample comprised of 248 male combat commanders in the Israeli Defense Forces and their female partners. Perceived support was being measured using the Perceived Agent of Social Support Questionnaire, the PASS. It's a 12-item instrument combining the two theoretical frameworks of social support, agent of support and type of support. Each item is a combination of elements from both frameworks. For example, The item, to what extent do you feel you're supported emotionally by your spouse, combines emotional support, type of support, and spouse, agent of support. Relationship satisfaction was being measured by the Enriched Marriage Quality Questionnaire. This questionnaire examines the quality of marriage, that means the degree of satisfaction and suitability in the marital system, and is based on the American tool Enriched. The instrument was translated into Hebrew and adapted to the Israeli culture. And it includes 10 items that examine 10 aspects of the relationship, such as communication, problem solving, free time, and interest. And some description on the sample, on the characteristic of the sample population. The ages of the combat commanders ranged from 25 to 57, when the average age being 36, while the wives is 35. The years of marriage ranged from 1 to 22, when the average was 10. The number of children ranged from no children, 0 to 7, and the years of service ranged from 1 to 32, when 14 being the average. The highest rank was general, and the lowest was captain. 40% considered themselves religious Orthodox, 40% as non-religious, and 20% as traditional. And another interesting fact is 55% lived near the wife's family. When we examined the correlation between rank, years of marriage, and perceived support, there was no significant correlation regarding the combat commander, while as for the wives, there was significant positive correlation between rank and perceived support. The ranks were on an axis from 1, general, to 7, lieutenant. So the higher the rank number was, but actually defined a lower rank, the higher the perceived support was. And of course, respectively, we found negative correlation between years of marriage and perceived support. We also found no significant correlations between rank, years of marriage, and marital satisfaction. Our first hypothesis was that each partner's adjustment that was measured by marital satisfaction will be correlated with his or her adjustment. And indeed, this is what we found, positive correlation between partners' marital satisfaction. Our second hypothesis was there will be differences in the level of marital satisfaction and perceived support between Israeli combat commanders and their spouses. Applying ANOVA by repeated means revealed an effect between spouses in the perception of spouses' support. Male combat commander reported higher levels of perceived support than did their female spouses. As we can see here, the mean for the men was, the combat commanders was 4.40, and for the wives was 3.95. There were no significant differences in marital satisfaction between male combat commanders and their female spouses. For combat commanders, the level of marital satisfaction was 5.71, and for the wives, 5.66. And our third hypothesis was that marital satisfaction will be correlated with each partner's perceived support. And indeed, we found significant correlations between each partner's perceived support and the marital satisfaction for the combat commanders as well as for their wives. Now, the dyadic model, the analysis of the data in the study, was conducted using the actor-partner AP model. The unit of analysis according to this model is the dyad. The model enables us to examine each spouse reports with his or her partner. Applying the AP to examine dyadic dynamics revealed both actor and partner effects for both combat commander and their wives. Levels of perceived support among combat commanders were higher than those among their spouses, whereas there was no significant differences in their marital satisfaction. Positive and significant associations of actor and partner effects were found for both combat commander and the wives, with a stronger contribution of the actor. So, families of combat commanders in the IDF are a unique population that must cope with a demanding and challenging way of life. And the findings on perceived support are similar to other studies on that subject between couples. As for gender differences, these findings support findings of previous studies on gender differences in terms of support provision, arguing that wives provide better social support than do husbands, and reinforcing the finding that women have larger networks and receive support from multiple sources, whereas men tend to rely on their spouses. In contrast, there are also findings suggesting that husbands and wives are equally skilled in their ability to provide support to spouses. These differences could possibly be attributed to the unique population at the heart of this study. That is, it could be that combat commanders understand the steep price their wives pay and are particularly appreciative of their wives' support. In order to better understand what underlies perceived support among couples, we can look at it through the lens of attachment theory, which offers a coherent theoretical framework to explain how and why people's perception affect the way they see their spouses and relationship. Bowlby in 1969 wrote, "Attachment theory conceptualized support provision as caregiving, which exists to provide protection, feelings of security, and support to others in need of assistance." Attachment theory sheds light on understanding the need for support, emphasizing the importance of support processes in building trust in intimate relationship, and looks at support as a dyadic process under the assumption that spouses take on the role of attachment figure for each other. The way in which a partner's supportive behavior is translated depends on the totality of the recipient's positive and negative feelings about the partner and the marital relationship. Thus, it is the perception of the support rather than the actual support given that seems to matter most. Feeling supported reflects one's inner belief that when necessary, there will be someone to help. Indeed, among combat commander couples who spend such a limited amount of time together and whose relationship is not based on daily, concrete, joint experience, perceived support seems likely to play an important role. This study has, of course, some limitations. First of all, the sample was based only on married heterosexual couples. It's a cross-sectional study. The study population was not compared to any other population, and the study examined only partners' perceived support. So as for future challenges, I want to examine different types of other agents of support, to examine additional resources of the combat commander couples like differentiation of self and communication, and to have a qualitative research. Thank you for listening.
So thank you very much, Limor, for your presentation. Some very interesting issues raised there and information provided. Just wanted to remind everyone right now that there is no Q&A for this session. Unfortunately, Limor couldn't join us for that. We are about to head into a break at this point in time. And I would ask everyone to please return for 11:25 when we will resume our next presentation. Thank you. Good morning, everyone, again. Welcome back. Hopefully you had a fulfilling break. We'd like to move straight along to our next presenter, who is Linda Manser. presenting an overview of Canadian military families.
Hi, my name is Linda Manser, and I'm the Associate Director of Research and Strategic Program Development with Military Family Services. Today, I'm pleased to present an overview of recent research on Canadian military families. As per CIMVHR form requirements, I have no relationships with commercial interests to disclose. I have no commercial support and no potential conflicts of interest. And I have no potential biases to mitigate. At the conclusion of this activity, participants will be able to describe the characteristics and concerns of Canadian military families and their requirements for comprehensive supports. In 2018, Canadian Forces Morale and Welfare Services was tasked with conducting research to inform the development of a comprehensive military family plan as part of Canada's national defence policy. To determine how best to support military families, it was essential for us to understand who Canadian military families are, where they are posting, and what challenges they are facing. To do this, we compiled and analyzed demographic data. We reviewed over 100 Canadian research reports to better understand the military family journey and the challenges they face. We identified, mapped, and analyzed over 200 CAF services. And through this, we made recommendations whereby families would be aware of and able to advocate for services that are available and aligned with when, where, and how they need them. This presentation is a short summary of what we found. Next, please. How many military families are there in Canada? To start, I must be clear that these demographics are as of August 2017, just a moment in time, knowing that families change daily. Each day new recruits join and CAF personnel leave the military. They get married, they get divorced, they have a baby, they move. So these numbers are specifically just for Reg Force members posted in Canada in August 2017. They also do not include Reg Force posted outside of Canada, and they do not include Reserve Force. That said, in total, in August 2017, there were 63,270 Reg Force members posted in Canada, with 34,910 spouses and 57,640 children. Next. Where do they live? Almost 40% of all Reg Force posted in Canada live in Ontario. And while in the past, most families lived in military housing on base, many of these have closed, and most families now live in the civilian community. That said, more than 80% of all Reg Force personnel still live on or within a 30-minute drive away from the base they are posted to. Next. What do these families look like? Overall, 56% of Reg Force posted in Canada are married or common law, while 44% are single and or separated or divorced. Almost half of all Reg Force posted in Canada have children, and of those Reg Force with children, 14% are single parents. Next. More than half of all Reg Force are under the age of 35 or have served less than 10 years, and almost half of all spouses are also under the age of 35. And there's an even split among children under 5, primary school-age children, and adolescents. Next. We also looked more closely at the gender of Reg Force posted in Canada, and what we found was that female Reg Force personnel, while representing only 15% of the total Canadian Armed Forces, have proportionally greater caregiving responsibilities than male Reg Force. Of those Reg Force with children, 15% are female and 85% are male, which is the same as the overall gender ratio. But of all Reg Force who are single parents, 24% are female and 76% are male, which is higher than the 15 to 85% ratio. Similarly, of all Reg Force caring for a declared disabled child, 28% are female and 72% are male, again higher than the general 15 to 85% ratio. Next. The marital status of Reg Force with children is also very different when broken down by gender. Among male Reg Force personnel who have children, 11% are single, 80% are married to a civilian, and 9% are part of a dual service couple. But for female Reg Force personnel who have children, 18% are single parents, 29% are married to civilian, and 53% are part of a dual service couple. What this suggests to us is that female Reg Force not only have greater caregiving responsibilities while they are serving, but they are also more likely to be completely immersed in the military culture, which could impact them more negatively when they eventually transition out of the military to the civilian community. Next. To better understand the experiences of military families, we created a simple journey map. There's a military journey from recruitment through trainings, through postings and deployments, possibly through injury, and finally through to release. Families must adapt to the challenges that arise from these military requirements and transitions. And then there's also the family journey. And that journey starts with one's childhood family to moving out as a single adult, possibly through marriage and having children, possibly through family breakdown or starting a blended family, to helping adult children move out of home, and then through to retirement and death. Each of these major life events require adjustments, alter individuals, and change the family. Sometimes these cause hardship, and sometimes these create family resilience and growth. Research has shown that military families commonly face 3 military and 3 family journey challenges. Next. The 3 most significant military journey challenges are 1, geographical relocations due to military career postings, 2, absences from family due to operational requirements, and 3, operational related illness, injury, or death. Next. The 3 most common family journey challenges that can both compound or be compounded by the military challenges include 1, personal well-being and mental health, 2, financial stress, and 3, intimate partner relationships. Next. That said, the vast majority, or 80% of military families manage these challenges successfully and feel they are resilient. Only 10% feel they are struggling. And there are still many unknowns, however, especially with respect to different family compositions or personas. But for now, I'll explore what we found in the research for each of the 3 military journey challenges a little more in depth. Next. The first military challenge is relocations. Almost 1 in 4 Reg Force receive a posting each year requiring a relocation to a new base, and 1 in 5 overall are interprovincial. This translates to approximately 10,000 families moving each year, of which 8,000 of these are moving to a different province. Posting relocations are highly diverse among Reg Force, depending on rank, environment, occupation, etc. So it's virtually impossible to say how often families must relocate during the career. Next. So those are the numbers, but what about the impacts caused by relocating? We know that about 1 in 4 spouses and children do not have a family doctor. 3 in 10 spouses feel they're underemployed. And between 6 to 18% of families have additional requirements that make relocations much more challenging, such as single parents, dual serving couples, or families with special needs, or those responsible for elder care. The financial situation of 50% of families worsened after relocation, primarily due to civilian spousal lost wages and increases in housing and cost of living. Only 25% said their financial situation improved, and 25% remained the same. Of all family members, adolescents struggle the most because of relocations, both academically and socially. Academically, adolescents suffered because of disruptions caused by curricula changes across education systems. And socially, as this age group's social support network shifts away from family to peers, disruptions in these peer groups can cause more challenges. There's also an increasing need for elder care that is presenting new challenges for families. Next. The second military journey challenge is operationally required absences from the family. Like relocations, deployments and absences are also highly diverse among Reg Force, depending on rank, environment, occupation, missions, etc. So it's virtually impossible to say how many deployments and absences family must deal with throughout the career. But as a snapshot in time, from research samples reflecting members at all stages of their career, about 2/3 at any time had experienced an absence from their family within the past 1 to 3 years, while 1/3 had not. And unlike relocations, where adolescents were most negatively impacted, with absences, it's the younger children who are more negatively impacted, as their stage of development requires a strong parent-child attachment, which can be disrupted with lengthy or repeated separations. Next. The third military journey challenge is operational illness, injury, or death. While only a small percentage are affected, the impact is substantial. From 2008 through 2018, an average of 1,500 Reg Force members were medically released each year, affecting an estimated 800 spouses and 1,350 children. It's important to note that these numbers vary significantly year by year, so while we may have numbers, it's difficult to generalize beyond just a moment in time. Of medical releases, approximately 40% are releasing due to psychological limitations and 60% due to physical limitations. Overall, the majority transition without any difficulties, but 25% do experience difficulties. The impact of illness and injury on the family vary depending on a wide variety of factors, not the least of which is whether the injury is psychological or physical. Next. In our most recent study, still being analyzed, we found that parents and spouses themselves found the transition personally difficult, with more than a third expressing they experienced a great deal of difficulty. The preliminary results from this study show 4 common emerging themes that were consistent across both parents and spouses or partners of medically releasing personnel. First, parents and spouses were frustrated by a general lack of information on the release process. Second, the transition impacted the entire family, not just the member. Third, the release transition impacted the health of the caregiver themselves, that is, the spouse, partner, or the parent of the medically releasing member's physical and mental health was impacted. And the fourth theme is that the release process had negative effects on the family financial situation. Next. Outside of the challenges facing families, we also mapped and analyzed over 200 different services and programs offered through the CAF for Reg Force families posted in Canada. And we reviewed several studies that explored family usage of services. So what did we find? In general, four main themes. Depending on the service, only 25% to 70% of families are aware these services exist. The usage of support services is very low. Of those who had used MFRC services in particular, the majority were satisfied and believed they received the assistance they needed. And 1/3 of spouses felt that the CAF looks after families, while 1/3 disagree. But 20% of spouses needed services that they said were not available, and many felt that the existing services were not relevant to their lifestyle. The majority want the same quality of support services across the country, and they also want more convenient delivery, such as off-base, after work hours, and online. Next. So while we know a lot more about military families and their challenges than we did 5 years ago, there is still a great deal of research to be done. Almost all research is focused on traditional families of Reg Force posted in Canada. But what about all the other types of families? What are the similarities and differences to the general population? Why are some struggling while others are not? And is research informing practice? That is, are our services based in evidence? And how do we know if our services are actually helping families deal with the military lifestyle challenges? Is our practice informing evidence and guiding future research directions? Next. Finally, I'd like to thank you for your time. The full reports that this presentation was built from can be found online at cafconnection.ca/CMFP. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Linda. You know, as you know, a lot of that I have had the opportunity to see before, but it's been critical as far as informing us. The more we know about our community, the better we can serve them, of course. First question that comes to us is, can you tell us about your biggest insights from the research you've done on military and veteran families, family life, and/or family experiences?
Yeah, sure. So I think the biggest insight that I've gotten over the past few years is to really challenge our assumptions. Our assumptions are not always correct. So I think when I had started this work about 10 years ago, the assumption was that military families were hurting, they were broken. Families were breaking up, children were being damaged because of the absences and the missions. And what we've been seeing is that In fact, 80% are actually doing really well, and they're actually doing really well without a lot of extra support, which means that there's a lot of resilience. There's a lot of assets out there that exist that because we've been focusing on the negative and the challenges, that we were kind of missing the mark, I think, in some aspects of learning from some of these families about what's really working for them. So I would say that's my biggest one, is that we really challenge our assumptions and look at different areas.
Yeah, it's always wonderful when research actually supports what we're lucky enough to see on a daily basis. So that's really great. We do have a question. Did you find any differences unique to civilian male spouses and their needs when you compare between the military spouses?
Yeah, that's another interesting question. Honestly, the sample sizes of most of the research studies that are out there with civilian spouses, the sample size of males is so small that we never really get a good indicator of what's going on compared to females. We're definitely seeing differences on the military personnel in terms of gender. So male military members versus female military members, their experiences are very different. So I mean, I'll go back to challenging assumptions. My assumption would be that there would be some very significant differences for male civilian spouses versus female. But right now, I would say absolutely, it's an unknown area that needs to be explored a bit more.
Yeah, it'd be wonderful to hear more about that. That would be great. I just one other question that I had, talking about the aspect of geographic or environmental variables to what your overall research was showing. Is there significant geographic differences?
I expect there is again, and we'll come back to some assumptions again. These are my assumptions that there will be. Similarly, with a lot of the sample sizes of the research studies are quite small, so it's really hard to tease apart if there are differences. But there are some obvious ones that we know for sure, especially around the types of deployments, the types of absences. They're very different in the Navy versus the Army. So we know that anecdotally, there's a lot of differences on the family itself. But again, it's another area that another insight into research is that you have to keep digging, right? You start to find out one thing and then it raises a whole lot of other questions. So my assumption is that there are differences. What they are exactly, yet to be found out.
Excellent. You included single military members in your demographics of family variations. Can you clarify if all of your follow-up stats included or didn't include single members' needs in your research stats?
Okay, so the front half of it, where we talked about the number of single members, that was just demographic data analysis. Most of the research studies, in fact, almost all of them, except for some around illness and injury, were on the family members, almost always on the spouse of a military member. So most of those stats around the impacts on children, the impacts on spouses are on the family side. You have to tease it apart quite a bit. So like on relocation, we talk about the different financial impacts on families. That does include single members. It really depends on where the information was pulled from which study and who it included. But for the most part, it's the impacts on the family would have excluded the single member.
Okay. Thank you very much, Linda, and thank you very much for the work that you do. It's much appreciated.
Thank you.
So our next presenter, just a minute, is Dr. Eric Spickel, presenting Identifying the Psychological Health Outcomes of Families of Those Who Have Served in the Armed Forces in the Five Eyes Alliance, a systematic review.
Hello, so I'm Dr. Eric Spickel from the Stress, Trauma, and Related Conditions Research Lab at Queen's University Belfast. I want to state I don't have any relationships with commercial interests in the form of grants, research support, no membership in speaker bureaus or any honoraria, and I have not taken any consultant fees. Next slide, please. I have no conflict of interest in regards to this research project, Forces in Mind Trust, or in any other way. This program did receive financial support from the Forces in Mind Trust in the form of a grant for our project, Understanding the Psychosocial Determinants of Psychological Health and Well-Being for Veteran Families in the UK. Next slide, please. So I feel that mitigating potential bias, in research is of paramount importance. And as an early career researcher, I do not have any relationships with any commercial interests concerning this research or otherwise. I have no conflicts of interest in conducting, publishing, or presenting this research. Next slide, please. Thanks. So at the conclusion of this presentation, you should be able to explain the potential psychological effects of a veteran service on intimate partners and their adult children, to understand the mental health outcomes in veteran family members in the Five Eyes Alliance countries, to describe the increased risks of PTSD, anxiety, depression, and psychological distress in this population, to reflect on the qualitative themes family members have used to describe their experiences, and to recognize the need for additional research to address the gaps in literature that we've identified. Next slide, please. Thank you. This presentation is based on the work identifying the psychological health outcomes of families of those who have served in the armed forces in the Five Eyes Alliance, a systematic review. At the time of presentation, this is currently in press, and there's a reference at the end of the presentation. Next slide, please. Thank you. So it's well understood that a service person's military experience affects their family members, especially their children and intimate partners. There exists a great deal of research on these effects in active duty families, particularly those with children, but very little literature discusses the veteran family and the now adult children of veterans. Of particular interest here were psychological and well-being outcomes in this population, and as the first function of the UK Veterans Family Study, our team conducted a scoping review to just assess the literature on veteran family research specific to the Five Eyes Alliance countries. Those are Australia, Canada, New Zealand, the United Kingdom, and the United States. So we conducted a systematic review, as it is one of the best ways to rigorously search out, synthesize, and summarize a body of literature, retaining only the quality research matching the exact criteria set by our research question. We were interested specifically in positive as well as adverse outcomes, as we found that a great deal of military research trends towards concentrating on mental illness, alcohol and substance misuse, deployment difficulties, child developmental issues, intimate partner violence, and other just all over negative outcomes. Thus, well-being and resilience studies were part of the inclusion criteria here. Now, the primary goal of the review was to summarize the extant literature, but we were also interested in identifying gaps in the literature, which would then inform the research for the UK Veterans Family Study. Next slide, please. Thanks. So first, a detailed protocol was written by the project team explaining the review methods, questions, context, all relevant definitions, search strategy, inclusion and exclusion criteria, quality appraisal, data extraction, and synthesis methods. This protocol was submitted to Prospero, and now that's the International Prospective Register of Systematic Reviews, and it's an online database of systematic review protocols that are submitted prospectively to help maintain researcher integrity. Articles were considered for inclusion here if they concerned the target populations, they covered psychological outcomes, were published in a peer-reviewed format in English between the years of 2000 and 2020 inclusive. So search strings using keywords and Boolean operators were drafted for searches in databases such as Medline, PsycInfo, Embase, Informate, PTSD, Pubs, and Web of Science, and also for use in the archives of relevant military health journals. So 2 members of the research team conducted blinded searches, resulting in nearly 30,000 records prior to title and abstract screening. And after screening, the researchers unblinded to discuss and review 84 potential articles against the inclusion criteria. Now, ultimately, only 24 papers could be included, 18 quantitative and 6 qualitative. And due to very diverse methodologies in the quantitative studies, a true meta-analysis of these results was not possible. So we decided on a narrative synthesis to describe that literature. And a meta-synthesis, specifically a descriptive interpretive approach, was chosen to analyze the qualitative results, creating meta-themes from the literature's subordinate themes. Next slide, please. Thanks. So concerning the overall results. The 24 studies included 12 from Australia, 8 from the US, 2 from Canada, and 2 from the United Kingdom. We had no results, unfortunately, from New Zealand. The number of participants in these studies ranged from 3 all the way up to 2,000, and the populations were predominantly female, with 13 studies reporting a completely female population. So the 18 quantitative studies were assessed by study population, with 12 covering intimate partners and 6 covering adult children. So depression was the most frequently examined, occurring in 11 studies, followed by anxiety in 9 studies, general distress in 8, alcohol and substance misuse in 6, and PTSD in 5, though several studies examined more than one outcome. Now, most of the partner studies focused on partners of veterans with PTSD and the secondary effects of the disorder on the partner. Overall, intimate partners showed higher rates of anxiety, depression, and PTSD when compared to national rates or to control samples, with adverse psychological outcomes more likely to reduce help-seeking behavior. Now, partners are more likely to experience distress due to the veteran's mental health issues and more likely to engage in hazardous drinking behavior associated with their veteran partner's distress and drinking. Adult children of veterans were at increased risk of anxiety, depression, alcohol and substance misuse, and PTSD associated with the veteran parent's PTSD, which also was found to have a negative impact on attachment and family emotional climate. Now, one study found adult children of deployed veterans had an increased risk for suicide and self-harm over those of non-deployed veterans. Now, of the 18 quantitative studies, 5 reported either non-significant results or results which lost significance once adjusted for covariates or compared against a control. Next slide, please. Thanks. So looking at the qualitative results of the 6 qualitative studies, 4 covered intimate partners, 1 covered adult children, and 1 centered on the family as a unit. And all studies describe the relationship between participants and the veteran's PTSD. So using a meta-synthesis analysis of the themes which emerged in each study, 4 meta-themes emerged, and these were described as personal feelings and internal emotions, veteran-oriented, help and support, and acting as a unit. The diagram on this slide includes all the subordinate themes under their meta-theme heading. So partners described feeling isolated, with their physical and mental health adversely impacted by the veteran's PTSD, and described an altered sense of self. The impact of caring for their partner and managing other aspects of life led to a feeling of loss regarding the veteran's former self, unwelcome feelings of burden, and sometimes an environment of tension and fear. Partners described needing and desiring support, but experiencing significant barriers. However, they did remain committed to their veteran and to the relationship, kind of externalizing PTSD as something to be fought. The adult children population consisted of 3 children of an Australian Vietnam veteran, and they described fundamental damage to their sense of self, with lasting developmental and adult consequences. It was particularly damaging to their relationship with their father. Now, the family study brought in themes of support for the entire family, the family's role as a unit in facing PTSD, managing the changes and adverse psychological outcomes due to PTSD. Now, speaking positively, though, some took meaning from this experience, describing a journey of vicarious growth, growthful forgiveness and self-care, but adverse themes did overwhelmingly outnumber positive themes, unfortunately. Next slide, please. Okay, so what does this all mean? So the review was conducted to highlight and address gaps in the literature concerning the mental health outcomes of partners and adult children of veterans in the Five Eyes Alliance countries. Now, ultimately, only 24 studies met the inclusion criteria, and this exposes the underrepresentation of this population in previous research, but it also does flag the potential and overwhelming need for future studies. So all in all, half the studies reviewed were Australian and all focused on family members of Vietnam veterans specifically. They compared the increased risk in these populations to national prevalence rates. All the U.S. studies were quantitative, with a majority featuring non-significant results and centering on the relationship between the veteran's PTSD and the partner's distress. The Canadian studies were qualitative explorations of partner and family unit experiences of the veteran's PTSD, highlighting both positive and negative themes. And the UK studies were also partner-centric, and they examined increased risk and issues surrounding access to support. So no study expressly examined positive outcomes such as resilience and well-being, unfortunately. Now, it must be noted, it is very important to remember that a majority of veterans have no mental health issues or other distress resulting from their service experience, and by concentrating solely on clinical samples, outcomes in their families are missed. So research focusing on all veterans, gathering data on both positive and adverse outcomes, would thus work to serve the entire community. Next slide, please. Thanks. So to look at implications and some future research, from the small body of literature that's available, it is evident that a subgroup of adult children and partners of veterans may face unique mental health risks dependent on individual factors, but also associated with veteran PTSD. So as described previously, due to the lack of population-level research, the results here cannot be taken as representative of veteran families in Five Eyes Alliance countries. Additional research is very urgently needed to explore not only the mental health outcomes in veteran families, but also to investigate the factors associated with resilience and well-being, especially among adult children, as most child-centric military research focuses on development and educational outcomes, ignoring the adults that those children become. So research into all aspects of mental health and well-being for these populations would be an important resource in designing civilian transition and reintegration programs, mental health and well-being initiatives, and other venues of support. To begin to address those needs, we have to first understand those needs. And the quantitative sections of the UK Veterans Family Study was very heavily influenced by the scoping review, taking into account all of the findings here. So we aim to fill some of those gaps in literature, but also to approach research into veteran families from an ecological systems perspective, kind of a holistic all-family perspective, hopefully to the benefit of the entire community. Next slide, please. Thanks. So these are the references used to produce this paper. They're also available on request. As I mentioned before, the paper is currently in press at this time. I wanted to thank you for your time and attention today, and I'm open to whatever questions that you might have.
Thank you very much, Eric. There was an awful lot of information in a very short period of time. That's for certain. A couple of questions that we can start with. If you started with about 30,000 results from your systematic research, why was the analysis on 24 studies?
Well, basically, because these 24 studies were the only ones that met our inclusion criteria. When we used the search strings, we got a lot of results that had very little to do with what we were actually looking at, but they would catch, for example, depression in a military context, but would be dealing with a population that was part of our exclusion group. There were a lot of really great papers, especially coming out of Eastern Europe and Israel, that I would have wanted to include it, but as our inclusion criteria was only research from Five Eyes Alliance countries, we did have to exclude that. Believe me, I felt counting every single one of those 30,000 results. But.
So, and the purpose for limiting it to the Five Eyes, was there, what was the instigation for that?
There were a few. A commonality of language, first of all, and also we did only search for papers in English. And also because there was a commonality of military culture, not something that you could do a cross comparison by country, but we felt that the Five Eyes Alliance countries was a good place to start to inform the UK Veterans Family Study.
Oh, perfect. There's a lot of research into things like resilience and well-being. Can you explain why did all of the research in your review concern adverse outcomes? You touched on it a little bit, but.
Well, it was really unfortunate because, like I said, there were a lot of really good papers that I did find that did go into a lot of positive, especially resilience. But a lot of those papers dealt with active duty families or families that were in transition to civilian life. There was a really great paper, and I can't remember the team that was behind it, but I believe it was Canadian spouses and resilience during deployment. And I read the whole thing. I was like, oh, I really wish we could include this, but it's active duty. Again, the want to balance out using clinical populations with our upcoming study of using the whole family was the fact that I know that there is research into positive aspects of the military family out there. And I really wanted, to get away from, oh, it's just about PTSD, it's just about depression, it's just about all these adverse outcomes, because we know that that's not the case.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. So from one of the questions from our audience was PTSD reporting from families based on formal diagnosis or informal experience?
That was one of the reasons that we had to kind of take the narrative approach that we did in the quantitative and qualitative parts of the systematic review, is that there was no standardization across the 24 papers that we reviewed. And the 18 quantitative papers did use different measures for determining what the clinical threshold was. So
okay.
It was kind of hedgy.
Yeah. So if you, from what you've learned through this, what would be your #1 priority, or what are you most excited about looking at next?
Well, we're actually kicking off within the next few months for the UK Veterans Family Study. And I'm actually very interested in looking into what the opinions of the adult children. Part of the study has already started, and we have some qualitative interviews that are ongoing. But we designed the quantitative survey to get at the whole family and centering themselves as well. Like we want to look at the spouse and intimate partners, how they've been impacted by being in a military family, but also how are they doing? And so I guess it's everyone's life from their own point of view, kind of, and how they all fit together to form the military family.
Excellent. So our last question, did any of the identified studies outline services specific to distressed partners, adult children in their own right? So you've kind of answered that, but did any of them specifically deal with distressed partners or adult children?
Yes, the one that sticks out the most to me that dealt with adult children, which it was the smallest sample because it was a sample of 3 siblings who had a father who had served in Vietnam, and that was a qualitative study. And I found that was very compelling. Qualitative studies tend to be hearing someone in their own words, just the 3 different siblings and how interacting with their father who's suffering from PTSD due to Vietnam, how that changed each of them at their formative years and then informed the adults that they became. And so that was really, really interesting. There was one study that, again, flags in my mind, which was a dyadic study on hazardous drinking and problem drinking behavior. And there was a reinforcing effect where the veteran and their spouse or intimate partner, their hazardous drinking behavior would inform each other's hazardous drinking behavior. So it wasn't kind of, you wouldn't say, oh, well, the veteran partner, they caused their spouse or intimate partner to have these behaviors, but it was kind of like a reinforcing between the couple. So
interesting. Well, thank you very much. We appreciate all the information that you've provided us today, and look forward to hearing more. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
So our next presentation will be again by Linda Manser, presenting the family experience through the medically releasing military to civilian transition.
Hello, my name is Linda Manser, and I'm the Associate Director of Research and Strategic Program Development with Military Family Services, Division of Canadian Forces Morale and Welfare Services. Today, I'm pleased to present the preliminary results of our most recent study on the family experience through the medically releasing military to civilian transition. As per CIMVHR requirements, I have no relationships with commercial interests to disclose. I have no commercial support and no potential conflicts of interest. And I have no potential bias to mitigate. At the conclusion of this activity, participants will be able to describe the impacts of the medical release process and the military to civilian transition on the spouses and parents of CAP personnel. I'll first go over the study goals and methods, then I'll highlight some of the findings, and finally, I'll review some of the recommendations that were made by the respondents themselves. I should note that these findings and recommendations are preliminary as we have not completed our final analysis and report yet. Next. Over the past decade or so, an average of 1,500 Reg Force members have medically released each year, affecting an estimated 800 spouses and 1,350 children. Past research has suggested that only 25% of releasing personnel experience difficulties. However, service providers have suggested that the process may be just as difficult, or perhaps even more so, for the family members who quite often must shift roles from loved one and partner or parent to caregiver for their loved one. The objective of our research study was to understand the needs of spouses or parents of medically releasing personnel, in particular with respect to their unique stressors, transition needs, resilience, and their need for and access or use of support resources and information. Our online survey was designed to get input specifically from parents or spouses and partners of CAF, Reg Force, and Reserve Force members who were in the process of medically releasing or had medically released within the past 5 years. Next. The online survey went live in November 2019 and stayed open for 3 months. Recruitment for participants went out through military family resource centers in 32 locations, as well as through CAF transition centers and Veterans Affairs Canada. An email invitation was also distributed to over 150,000 CF1 members. Of those who completed the survey, 259 qualified, as in they were spouses and partners or parents. 85% of these were English and 15% of these were French. 2/3 of respondents were civilian spouses or partners. 27% were spouses who were also military personnel or part of a dual service couple, and 6% were parents of a military member. 80% of respondents were female, 55% were 45 years of age or older, and 46% lived in Ontario. Of the medically releasing loved one, 85% were male, 92% had served in the Reg Force, and 55% were in the Army. There was an even split between those who had served less than 15 years, those who had served between 15 to 25 years, and those who had served more than 25 years. Almost half of all releasing were for both physical and psychological limitations. Next. Overall, more respondents found the transition difficult than we've seen in previous research on medical release transitions. In fact, almost all respondents found the transition difficult, with more than 1/3 expressing they experienced a great deal of difficulty. There were 4 common emerging themes that were consistent across both parents and spouses or partners. First is a general lack of information on the process. Second is that the transition impacted the whole family, not just the member. Third is that the transition impacted the health of the caregiver, that is the spouse or partner or parents. And the fourth is the effects of the family financial situation. I'll review each of these emerging themes in a little more detail. Next. The first common emerging theme was a general lack of information provided to the family. The respondent's single most challenging aspect of transition was trying to understand the available services and benefits. The majority of respondents reported that they received either no information or not much information about their loved one's acute care, medical stabilization, transition to outpatient care, and long-term rehabilitation and recovery. Illness or injury is a shock to all families. They feel out of control and unsure of what to do, especially in the middle of it. While the member is getting treatment or healing, family members must also manage their own reaction to the illness and injury while also ensuring their medical care. Getting more information at each stage of the process, during the process, can go a long way to reassuring and supporting families, giving them back some sense of control. The respondents also identified other challenging aspects to the transition, many of which could potentially be mitigated with the provision of more information, especially given the vast array of services and benefits that are available. These challenges included being financially prepared, finding healthcare providers, preparing for the loss of the military family identity, and finding post-service employment. Next. The second common emerging theme was that the transition impacted the whole family, not just the member. Almost all respondents found the transition difficult. The vast majority reported either some or a great deal of negative impact on other family members' health needs, economic and financial needs, access to services, and social needs. When respondents were asked to describe the impact the medical release had on their families in their own words, About 1/3 expressed they experienced a lack of support or were treated poorly and refused benefits. 27% described mental health issues that other family members were dealing with because of the medical release, and almost 1 in 5 experienced financial stress. A smaller percentage, but still a concerning number of family members, were dealing with stress, physical health issues, or a loss of social connections and identity as a direct result of the medical release process. Next. The third common emerging theme was on the health and well-being of the respondents, specifically in their role as caregiver. Almost 3/4 of respondents reported that they were spending extra time providing care and assistance to their medically releasing or released loved ones. Most reported feeling tired, worried, anxious, overwhelmed. A majority reported that they had suffered in the last 12 months as a direct result of their new caregiving responsibilities. Though it should be stated that this question was optional, so not all respondents chose to answer this question. But of the 173 respondents who answered the question on emotional health, 82% stated they'd suffered. Of the 170 respondents who answered the question on social well-being, 72% suffered. And of those who answered the question on their relationship with their loved one, 70% said their relationship had suffered. And finally, 61% of those who chose to answer the question on their physical health said they'd suffered in the last 12 months as a result of their caregiving responsibilities. While most respondents reported that their caregiving responsibilities are stressful or very stressful, respondents were split about their ability to cope. About 1 in 3 reported that they are coping, and 1 in 3 reported they are not coping. Next. Finally, the fourth common emerging theme was the effect on the family financial situation. More than half of the respondents reported that providing care had an impact on their employment and their ability to work. 2/3 are not satisfied with the balance between their work, life, and caregiving responsibilities. And almost half reported that their caregiving responsibilities had had a negative impact financially on their families. Respondents were asked to describe the negative financial impact in their own words, and 103 chose to answer. Of those who answered, common reasons revolved around reduced income and tight budgets, having to pay for additional services and expenses, and having to work less in order to provide care. Next. As part of this study, we directly asked participants for their own recommendations of what would have improved their experience with the medical release process. First, we asked respondents what would have been the most useful service to them from a list of options, where 1 was ranked as the most useful and 5 was ranked as least useful. 60% of those who responded to this question ranked someone who can help our family understand what services are available and can help coordinate those services for us were most important, resulting in an average of 1.7 out of 5. The next closest was someone who can help me and my family understand the illness or injury, with 24% of respondents ranking this service as number 1. We also asked for other services that may be of value that were not in the list provided, and 47 gave a response to this question. Of these, the most commonly requested services were a financial advisor, financial support, or a contact person. Next, please. Respondents were then asked which services they would have used if they had been available. This question was optional, so the percentages shown in this chart reflect just those who chose to answer this question. Almost 8 out of 10 would have liked a service that supported them to navigate through the available services and benefits. Close to 2/3 would have liked information and education on the illness or injury itself and the recovery path. 2/3 would have liked practical assistance, and about 1/2 would have liked access to counseling. There were gender differences in the counseling response. Female respondents are more likely than male respondents to say they would definitely use individual counseling, 56% versus 36%. And female respondents were also more likely to say they would definitely use information and education on how to care for oneself, 47% versus 25% of males. About half of respondents would have liked education and support for financial planning and financial management and/or direct financial assistance. Next. We also asked respondents where they would like to access these services if they had been available to them. This question was asked as there continues to be anecdotal information that families may resist accessing services through some providers for a variety of reasons, whether that's stigma, fear of negatively impacting the military career or the military benefits, or a lack of confidence in the quality of the services. Overall, respondents indicated they would prefer to access most services through the MFRC. There were only 3 services that respondents said they would prefer to access through a civilian organization rather than the MFRC. These 3 services were counseling, either individual or family counseling, and caregiver respite. We need a little more research to understand why MFRCs were not preferred for these specific types of services. Next. Finally, respondents were asked to describe in their own words what would be the most important service that military family support services could offer to assist them specifically in their responsibilities as a caregiver. These categories show the common themes respondents described in their answers. Once again, more information and education tops the list as the most important service that would assist them in their caregiving responsibilities. Following closely behind were financial support or increased financial assistance, as well as more understanding and support, including increasing options and access to services, again, specifically for their caregiving responsibilities. Next slide. In summary, I would like to reiterate once again that these are preliminary findings only. We have not been able to complete our final analysis yet, and so no report has been written or is available as a reference at this time. Thank you.
That was really insightful. I'm anxious to see the report when it's finally published. I think there's going to be some very useful and information within that. So just to start off with a couple of questions. Can you tell us about something you discovered in your research about military veteran families, family life, and or family experiences that led you to ask more questions?
Yeah, I think in this scenario, back up, in this research study in particular, I think so much of the research in the past had been focused on the military member, the releasing member, and the assumption was that the family, the support, whether it's the spouse or the parents, kind of just goes along for the ride and is there to give strength to the member, to, you know, we'll take care of them, we'll do all the caregiving. And there hasn't ever been really a lot of focus on how this process is affecting them. Like Eric had said in the past one, that family unit, the family goes through all of these things together. So it's important to understand how the entire unit is affected. And what surprised me with this study was how negatively impacted the parents or the spouses were, even more so than we've seen with the medically releasing member themselves. So that makes me want to dig a lot deeper.
That's wonderful to hear, because it would be nice. We do see smatterings of it, and you know, in a more anecdotal way, but it'll be wonderful to hear more insight in that, which leads me to the next question. So you talked about spouses and other family members. What about the impact on teen or young adults from a caregiving perspective? Because that's something that we do hear something about.
Yeah, absolutely. It's an area that we don't know. I haven't seen a lot of research on that area yet either. And I would like to dig into it a little bit more. There's some good studies out of thinking of Alice Gomarowski's work with the children of ill and injured members and what happens with them. And there's a little bit in there with youth as well. But with youth taking on that caregiving role, which often happens, I haven't seen anything on that yet. And I would expect, assumptions again, I would expect that their experience as moving into from child to caregiver would be even more exaggerated than what we're seeing with the spouse or the parent, because they're also in that tricky age of just trying to get your own life together as well. So I would love to see some more interest, some more research in this area as well. Yeah.
Excellent. So overall, what surprised you the most about the results that you ended up with so far?
So far, I don't know if I've got a most, but I think what did surprise me a bit was that with this study, that there was an even split between those who, almost all of them were really finding it difficult, but there was an even split between those who are doing well, coping through it, and those who weren't. And so I really want to drill down a little bit more into that to figure out, so what is it that those who feel they're coping okay with all of this heavy workload and caregiving and emotional toll, and what is it that's not working for people who aren't able to cope. So I'd really like to dig into that one a bit more. And the gender thing again, I mean, we haven't had time to dig down enough, but we did start to look at it in terms of that help seeking behavior, because we know from past research that females tend to have higher rates of help-seeking behavior than males, and we started to see that here as well. So I'd like to dig down into that a little bit more as well.
So it'd be interesting to find out too if there is the difficulties, were they short-term or longer-term situations? Because there could be, you know, initial issues, but yeah, having some insight in that would be really, really interesting.
Absolutely. And what it is, like, if the ones that aren't feeling that they're coping well, are they dealing with more financial issues? Are they dealing with more of that loss of identity issue? Like, there's so much to explore in here yet that we can't really speak to, but it's certainly interesting.
That's great. So that, I think, covers the questions that we had. So it's about time for us to go for break, I believe. Thank you very much, Linda. I could probably sit and talk to you for another hour on this, but it's time for us to go to break. But thank you very much. I really appreciated hearing what you had to say. So we'll move to our break time. I ask that everyone please rejoin us at 12:30 for our next presenter. So welcome back, everyone. Thank you for joining us again at our very informative family session A. The presentations so far have been quite interesting. We'll move now to our next presentation. Dr. Heidi Cram will be presenting Exploring the Experience of Parents of Ill and Injured Veterans.
Hi there, I'm Heidi Cram, and welcome to Exploring the Experience of Parents of Ill and Injured Veterans. I'm presenting on behalf of my team, which includes Deb Norris, Lena Tamsito, Nicola Fear, Rachel Gribble, and Allison Mahar. This research was funded by True Patriot Love, and we have no other commercial interest to report. We have no commercial support relationships to disclose, and it is not applicable for mitigating potential bias. So we really came to this work out of a series of other studies that we've done, which really tended to look at spouses of military and veteran individuals. And what we saw is that other individuals like parents weren't really represented in the research and also in programs, because programming and policy really tends to emphasize spousal and partner and child needs and issues. So we got really curious around, well, what happens with families and what is their experience? And especially when we see that parents may need to step in to support those who are injured or develop an illness after service or prior to release of service. So the purpose of this study was to explore the experiences of parents of Canadian Armed Forces veterans who are living with illness or injury associated with military service and that was connected to their release. This study was grounded in a constructivist interpretive paradigm, and we used a phenomenological approach to focus on experiences and meanings to create rich, thick narratives of their stories. We recruited through a variety of means. And I conducted the interviews that were in-depth, qualitative, semi-structured, and these parents had provided ongoing support to their adult children who has or was in the process of releasing. And so we employed an interpretive phenomenological analysis and used Max QDA, which is a software program to support coding and analysis. As a team, we used reflexive practices and debriefing to enhance rigor. So the sample ended up being 15 parents and parents-in-law. We had amended the recruitment because we did find that there were parents-in-law who had been providing this kind of enduring support, and we wanted to make sure that their voices were represented as well. And so what we ended up with was 13 different adult children, and all of the children represented had symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder and or moral injury as reported by their parents. The majority of the children represented in the study had deployed, and their PTSD or moral injury had been linked directly to events and stressors during those deployments. So in terms of results, we had several categories that emerged. One is that there were instrumental impacts on parents. Parents provided emotional support. They provided, as in this example, I'm emotional support for my son. I buy most of their clothes. I'm the go-to babysitter. I'm an extension of the parent. And so in this way, parents really took on considerable additional roles and instrumental tasks, often on a daily basis, and really, expressed how they were feeling the weight of the pressures. And this could be things like managing mail, medications, banking. They absorbed significant duties as grandparents, and they stepped up to ensure their grandparents had the basics for what they needed, good nutrition, clothes that fit, and absorb that expense as well. Providing the means for supervised visits to continue relationships with their children and their children's children, acting as a go-between between their adult child and his or her former spouse or partner. And they could play off one another if their parents had, a spouse of their own. But for parents who are on their own, they had additional difficulties because they didn't have the respite from this kind of ongoing pressure. They also expressed this kind of constant worry and guilt. And so, there was one parent in this quote, one father who said, military families have a role to play in terms of talking up the military career, like getting their kids excited about joining, and really reflected that it's not going to happen for parents to do this if we see our sons and daughters left by the wayside. Those of us around him who've seen him struggle, it's a big worry for us along the way, for sure. Parents described a constant and evolving nightmare of worries about what might trigger relapse, the safety and well-being of their children, their spouses, their grandchildren. How might things worsen without notice? How they worked on keeping their own grown children safe, and in several cases, preventing them from dying by suicide. They put their lives on hold with total focus on their child and their own children, but they really struggled and grappled with these efforts not resulting in positive outcomes and feeling guilty that somehow they hadn't done enough, or in their feelings that their children were, quote unquote, ruining our lives. Parents commonly expressed being at a loss for what to do and where to go, at an utter loss for what to do, as what to say and also what not to say, constantly feeling drained, walking on eggshells, how to best provide help without, quote unquote, upsetting the apple cart, knowing where to go and get resources for their children, but also for themselves. Basic psychoeducation about post-traumatic stress, moral injury, chronic pain, military sexual trauma. These were issues that they really had needed information, but hadn't found any central clearinghouse or aid to system navigation. So this parent shared that, for them with a child who was living with injury, there was nothing for them. Now, I don't mean to sound crass, but if he had lost his life, I'd be a member of a very special crowd, a very special group. I know that sounds awful, but I'd have people that I could go talk with and could understand what's going on. So they talked about the differences of supports that were available to Silver Cross parents, Silver Cross mothers, raised why are there not Silver Cross fathers? And also, where do they go for their ongoing support needs? They also talked about the impacts on their own health and well-being. They feel drained of time and energy to do the things they would normally been interested to do at that phase of their life. For some, they'd had to seek out mental services for themselves to help them process the situation, develop healthier boundaries, and deal with compassion fatigue. They expressed concern as well about those who are releasing who don't have family, who would step in and support them through their recovery and transition. One mother shared, "I can't think of any possible thing out of this. It's all been terrible. My family, they treat me like a little bit of glass." And not being able to talk about her son, because I won't talk about it with them. I lose it. Like, I start crying, and I don't want to cry all the time. So parents in the study, many of them were really living with enduring demands and pressures on their own health and well-being. Impacts on relationships. So these were very widespread impacts. There were significant costs to their relationships with both friends and family. There were opportunity costs when their other children and grandchildren didn't get the same time, attention, or financial assistance as their veteran child. The intensity of supporting their children left them with little energy or interest to engage socially, and with participants pulling back from friends and family in a kind of protective layer. There were layered and unwelcome additional issues within their interpersonal networks, and they were unable to explain it to others and found themselves in a defensive posture, combating stigma and judgment. From social connections that would say, like, you know, you've done what you can, just, you know, it's time for you. In this example of a parent whose daughter had experienced military sexual trauma, and people within the family really challenging her with ideas of, well, didn't she know what she was signing up for? With the expectation that military sexual trauma should have been an expectation of the veteran child's experience. And so as a mother of that daughter, really trying to make sense of, you know, I don't think you could ask a woman in Canada, say, you know, something I expect sexual assault to be part of my work experience. You shouldn't be accepting it in a workplace, but within the social group, kind of an expectation that it could happen and that it shouldn't be such a surprise. So they should just accept it and move on. So there's a lot of kind of grappling with these complex pieces. They also really expressed a sense of betrayal. So none of these parents, other than the notification of injury when those who were injured in a, say, an explosive event while deployed, aside from those notifications, these parents reported no interaction, no reach out from anybody at any point from defense or veterans. And so they really struggled with that because they felt quite isolated and they felt quite betrayed by the system. And while some parents retained a sense of pride in the children's military service, parents generally reported a deep sense of disillusionment and disappointment with the Canadian Armed Forces and or Veteran Affairs Canada. And they struggled to reconcile the service that their children had made and the heavy impacts that followed with no sense of support. They had, for the most part, really dedicated their lives to tireless advocacy, which came at great personal, financial, and occupational expense, and no one had recognized this. So they really felt like there could be more done, certainly for parents. So this parent said, you know, it would be nice to have somebody reaching out, somebody being a bit more proactive on the impact that this had on your child, someone who's got your back as you're trying to actually support your kids, somebody who would just call and ask you, you know, how's it going or something, some kind of counselor, someone who has a caseload of, I don't know, 20, 50, 25 or 50 families, and maybe they call them once a year. They say, how's it going and how did it go? Or is there anything we can do to facilitate something? Those are the kinds of things that outreach, that warm engagement with that family members really identified as something that they would enjoy. So, you know, what we found in terms of, you know, the big conclusions here were that these things, the involvement that the participants in our study, and recognizing that it's, you know, the 15 participants representing 13 different families, that their experience really came at great personal, financial, and occupational expense. They played crucial roles in, for some, the very survival of their children, the ongoing support, their recovery with illness and injury. And while they play these crucial roles, they felt forgotten and marginalized. Because they feel and have enacted these responsibilities for the children, they see themselves as part of the military unit. And again, don't see that being validated or recognized through policy or programming. And parents ultimately would like their roles, their contribution, and their rights acknowledged in the service delivery system, especially for accessing mental health supports, and to be able to have mental health supports of their own when they are actually struggling with trying to sort out what to do to best serve their adult children. So when we take this as a whole, it has several kinds of implications. One is that when we look at issues related to trauma, if we conceptualize things from more of a family-centered circle of care, we might be able to provide support to the people who are providing the support kind of on the front lines with those individuals, and make sure that they have their own needs recognized and addressed in their own right, and not just in relation to the individual who has experienced the trauma. Support with system navigation. You know, I asked many of the participants, you know, are you familiar with, you know, CIMVHR? Are you familiar with the Center of Excellence? Have you heard about? They really don't know. And as they're separated from, and they don't have that outreach, they don't, except for someone who had the experience very, very recently, anyone who'd been kind of out there for 3-5 years really was kind of flying blind without any sense of where to go and how the policies and programs continue to evolve. They don't have, I think one of the most notable things was recruitment for the study was so difficult because there's no network of wounded veterans families. So we couldn't tap into it. They all identified a need for psychoeducation to understand, like, well, what is moral injury? What is PTSD? Like, how do we talk about trauma? How do we provide help? When we think about the implications for caregiver benefit, you know, what is that? Who qualifies for that? How are we looking at instrumental caregiving? Couples and family therapy being provided and being available at different points of the transition process. Looking to see how parents could be included, recognized, and have their rights in the system clarified and recognized. And generally, you know, a change in public awareness and understanding what roles the parents are playing in supporting our troops post-service would also be appreciated beyond the Silver Cross Mother recognition that we're all familiar with through Remembrance Day ceremonies. So I thank you for your attention, and should you have any questions after the event, please reach out to me at heidi.cram@queensu.ca. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Heidi. I have about 200 questions that popped into my head, but I'll start with the data that you presented. It shapes a very compelling narrative. What would you see as the next steps for research?
Oh, thanks, Tamara. It's such a great question. You know, we really have just scratched the surface on trying to understand the experiences of these parents. You know, because they've been so difficult to reach, I think that being able to look at the roles of peer support for parents of the ill and injured, for the roles of system navigators, there's so many echoes in the things that we heard Linda Manser talk about in her study. And so I think that when we start to combine the efforts of different researchers looking at things from different perspectives, we start to really see what becomes possible and what the research is able to inform us for policy and program development. And I do think that using that to help us understand how we might reach families who aren't necessarily proximal to that release as well. I think that there's a lot to be said about policy environments that shift over time. And so when somebody releases from the military, you know, the services that are currently in place for families who are medically releasing is quite different from what was available 5 years ago, 10 years ago. And so how do we use the research to try to inform like a living system that can do that kind of outreach and that warm pull in to try and have people have the ability to opt out of new services, become aware of new services, rather than just not have any sense that there are things that are actually there that could support, engage, and respond to these kinds of needs that we're seeing.
Excellent. Yeah, I definitely agree. Did a question from one of the attendees, did any of the parents who participated in the study serve in the military themselves? And if so, did that have any impact on their experience supporting their adult children?
You know what? It was absolutely fascinating. And we didn't ask that question right off the hop, but we did very, very, very quickly. And what we saw was that it added a whole other layer. We had families who had no relationship to military service and came from, families and communities that were actually opposed to military service, and then their children actually joined. And to watch that dissonance and to try and grapple with that and what that process was like. But we also saw people who had served themselves, but that the nature of their service had been so different from the service and the service conditions and the nature of combat and deployment that their children had that caused another layer. The families who we ultimately reached are not necessarily representative, because we don't know how representative this experience is. I mean, most people release from the military without these kinds of issues. So we're looking at a small segment of the population. And then these parents, certainly, they have really experienced severe conditions for supporting their children. But that if they had military service, like some of them had, been socialized with a kind of suck it up buttercup kind of attitude. And then how to translate that into an empathetic understanding things like moral injury that weren't necessarily part of, how they were trained and how they served. So, these parents, I mean, they absolutely affected me as a researcher. Their stories were so compelling. And I think that there's so much that we owe them as researchers to better understand what their experiences are and what they need from all of us going forward.
Thank you. I'd love to continue the discussion. We are out of time at this point, but thank you very much. I'm very much looking forward to what comes next in regards to this area of research. So thank you.
Thanks so much.
All right, so our next presenter, Dr. Deborah Norris, is presenting the experiences of adult children of Canadian Armed Forces veterans serving between the Korean War and the Gulf War.
The title of this presentation is The Experiences of Adult Children of Canadian Armed Forces veterans serving between the Korean War and the Gulf War. And I'd like to give due credit to my co-authors on this paper, who include Heidi Cram, Marilyn Cox, and Allison Marr. Faculty presenter disclosure. My name is Deborah Norris with the Department of Family Studies and Gerontology at Mount St. Vincent. I have no relationships with commercial interests, and very happy to announce that the funding has been provided by the True Patriot Love Foundation. There are no relationships with commercial interests and no conflict of interests, as well as no mitigating potential bias. The learning objectives, as described on this slide, include describing the experiences of an understudied group, the adult children of Canadian Armed Forces veterans who served from the Korean War through to the Gulf War. Secondly, to identify demands, capabilities, and resources facilitating the resiliency of military families from the perspectives of the adult children. And finally, to consider recommendations to inform program and policy development for military and veteran families. Just speaking to these objectives for just a moment, we know that the demands of mobility, separation, and risk enhance capabilities and foster resiliency for some military children. It's not known, however, if capabilities developed during military childhoods are sustained through adulthood. In a similar way, the adaptive responses facilitating resiliency are poorly understood. retrospective accounts of the childhood experiences of an understudied cohort, the adult children of Canadian Armed Forces vets who served from the Korean War through to the Gulf War, gleaned through this exploratory study, offer insight into how these experiences shaped adult lives. Outcomes from this study can inform ongoing research, theorizing, and program and policy development. It's worth noting that while recruiting for other studies with military and veteran families, our team regularly received inquiries from adult military children who were raised during this era, from the Korean War through to the Gulf War. While these individuals did not meet the eligibility criteria for those studies and could not be included, it was clear that their voices and their experiences were missing from research with military-connected families. That is why we developed and implemented this study. This study is informed by 3 theoretical frameworks that are prominent in family science, and these include the Family Adaptation and Adjustment Response Model, which focuses on the interdependence between capabilities and meanings, the Circumplex Model, which focuses on cohesion and adaptability, and the conceptualization of resiliency developed by Bowen and Martin, which emphasizes not just intrafamilial factors, but also community factors. A phenomenological, interpretive, constructivist lens was used to reveal the absent voices and experiences of the adult children. In-depth, semi-structured interviews were conducted with 23 adult children of Canadian Armed Forces veterans who served during that time period. Participants were recruited from across Canada using an opportunistic sampling strategy through key informants and social media to facilitate the development of in-depth understandings of multiple perspectives. Due to restrictions associated with the COVID-19 pandemic, all interviews were done by phone. The interviews were recorded and transcribed and field notes maintained. Ethics clearance was obtained from the Mount St. Vincent University Research Ethics Board. Recorded interviews were transcribed verbatim and pseudonyms assigned to ensure confidentiality. As noted on my slide, transcriptions and demographic data were imported into MaxQDA, a qualitative analysis software program, coded and analyzed. An inductive approach was used to analyze the data, and transcripts read, reread, and segments coded, allowing themes to emerge. Participant profile. As noted on this slide, we were fortunate to receive interest from 23 individuals who fit the eligibility criteria. These individuals included 6 male-identified people and 17 who identified as females. The age range spanned from 35 to 78 years, with the median age being 64 years. All of the parents who served were fathers, 14 serving in the Air Force, 7 in the Army, and 2 in the Navy. Interestingly, 21 of the 23 lived in private married quarters for at least one posting, if not more. Only two lived in civilian housing. The findings of this study can be clustered into 4 overlapping categories. As noted on this slide, this includes family relationships, role adjustments and responsibilities, identity and belonging, and formal and informal supports. All 4 of these clusters are embodied within the adaptive responses to demands encountered, which are noted above. Interestingly, most participants self-identified as military brats. I was reticent at the beginning of the study to refer to them in that way because it seemed somewhat negative and perhaps even pathologizing. However, all 23 were very clear in their intent to wear that badge very proudly. In fact, it was described as a badge of honor. A strong sense of belonging and shared history was conveyed, and participants continue to maintain relationships with fellow brats from this era. Although relocation was described as a normal part of military family life and an opportunity for a clean slate or an adventure, relocations that occurred during adolescence when peer relationships and academic continuity become more important were difficult. Most said that changing schools was stressful and required adjustments, such as skipping a year, being put back a year, which was more challenging in high school and when they were placed in civilian schools. There was little attachment to schools or teachers because they were always changing, as reported by our participants. These participants felt that civilian teachers were sometimes unsympathetic to the nature of their military life. Despite this, many claimed to be good students, and all participants attained some level of post-secondary education. Participants remarked on their ability to adjust to new situations, assert themselves, and to overcome challenges. Sentiments that are expressed in the two first voice quotes included on this slide. They felt that the pattern of leaving friends behind and making new friends had fostered resilience, and skills that they developed in childhood became assets in adulthood. Participants reported that they find it easy to meet new people and make new friends. Many of the participants are currently active in volunteer organizations and youth sports, which highlights a continued interest and commitment to their communities. The quality of the parent-child relationships in this participant group varied, with some families being impacted by undiagnosed PTSD and alcoholism, as noted in the second quote on this slide, and echoed by others who participated in this study. Those whose fathers suffered with PTSD symptoms or alcoholism learned to self-regulate to manage parent reactions. PTSD was not formally diagnosed at this time, and there were no resources for families. Moments of rage and anger were anticipated, and family members, including these individuals when they were children, adjusted their behaviors to try to control outbursts. Participants felt that growing up with a parent with PTSD or alcoholism had enhanced their coping skills in adulthood because they had learned how to assess and manage stressful situations at home. Interestingly, as noted in the second quote here, they also reported an enhanced capacity for empathy, particularly for people who were struggling, which influenced careers for many of them in the helping professions. Family cohesion, flexibility, and communication, three elements of one of the foundational models guiding this study, consistently emerged in the interviews. Families who spent time together and were actively engaged reported more positive experiences. Those whose fathers were disengaged and emotionally distant were more aware of their father's shortcomings. The absences of the serving member parent who was perceived to be fair and responsible and put his family first were perceived to be manageable. The military approach to parenting and fathers who put the military first diminished family capabilities. Serving members who communicated by providing guidance and being emotionally available for their children were an important source of support. Perhaps one of the most profound outcomes of this study were the insights gained from the participants' recollections of their experiences growing up in base housing. Participants said children at that time had the freedom to go anywhere on the military bases. I remember 21 of the 23 participants indicated that they had spent at least one posting living on base. These bases were described as safe and self-contained communities. The layout was consistent and familiar, which simplified the relocation stresses. The physical infrastructure facilitated social interaction for both parents and children, with access to recreational facilities for a variety of activities, which were coached and organized by either parents or the military PT staff. Many felt that this environment had nurtured social skills, along with an appreciation for physical fitness and the outdoors. There were opportunities to meet new people and make new friends. As one participant stated, there were kids everywhere. Everybody knew what it felt like to be the new kid, which fostered reciprocity and empathy, sentiments expressed in the quote included in this slide. The community on the military base was a resource for families and provided participants with a sense of identity, connection, and belonging. Military bases were familiar, were safe places. The recreational activities and facilities helped develop those social skills. A significant objective of this study was to discern the extent to which the capabilities and meanings emerging from childhood experiences, the extent to which those transferred into adult life. On this slide, I have a cluster of first voice quotes that offer us some insight in this regard. Children, as reported by the adults interviewed, were given unique opportunities during their era to develop an awareness of world events, careers requiring international travel and leisure travel. Many of the adult participants in this study described their home as Canada, and some believed that growing up in a military environment had made them patriotic, civic-minded, and given them a global perspective, values that remain meaningful to them in adulthood. Some of the participants who served in the military as adults themselves were proud to follow the example of their fathers, while others were influenced by military connections outside of the family, peer groups, and cadets. And we have the report of one individual here on this slide who became a cadet. The importance of public service, again, a significant outcome embodied within the quotes you see before you, was also evident. Many indicated that from their perspective, that there's value to supporting your country and working in that environment. In fact, they indicated that many of their fathers, upon release from the military, transitioned into public service themselves when they retired, and participants in turn valued those roles. Those in private business, and we see examples from those in that sector on this slide, believe that their interpersonal skills, flexibility, and adaptability had contributed to their success and were influenced by their military upbringings. One participant appreciated the efforts that the military took to provide a good environment for families with a range of recreational facilities and activities for children. It was his opinion that the provision for families motivated military personnel to fulfill their roles, which in turn inspired his managerial style and people skills. In conclusion, one of the outcomes of this, or I guess a significant high-level outcome of this study is it reinforced the significance of conceptualizing resiliency as an outcome that emanates not just from intrapersonal or intrafamilial practices and processes, but based on the first voice accounts of the individuals in this study, it's very clear that resiliency as an outcome is also shaped and sustained by community resources and by the military institution itself. Lessons learned from this study that can be transferred into current thinking and current planning for military programs and policies. In conclusion, as noted on this slide, results suggest that resiliency is developed through experiences with the normative and non-normative demands characterizing the era in focus between the Korean War and the Gulf War in military operations. Capabilities, which emerged through this study as including family cohesion, communication, and meaning-making, facilitated adaptability. And finally, military-based communities emerged as a significant source of community support, a significant resource enhancing identity, connection, and life choices, not just in childhood and young adulthood, but all the way through the life course trajectory. My references are included on this final slide, and my contact information should you wish to follow up with me. Thank you very much.
I'm looking forward to hearing some additional thoughts from you. You must have had some amazingly rich conversations, for sure, from the experiences that those adults had as children. I guess we're looking at the first question be, findings from your research indicate that in the past, military-based housing offered children a sense of identity, connection, and belonging. Outcomes carried with them into their adult lives. What lessons can be learned from this for contemporary military families?
Thank you, Tamara, and thank you for your comments on what it was like to conduct this work. It was indeed a very rewarding experience. We felt like we were just opening the door, opening the floodgates to, not unlike Dr. Cram's study that she reported on previous to this one. This is an understudied, untapped group, and it just was very gratifying to be able to offer a platform for sharing. It was very significant to learn from these folks the extent to which base housing did shape and sustain their contemporary lives and their lives throughout the life course up to this point. And it underscored just how important some sense of community, a community resiliency, the ways in which it intersects with individual and familial resiliency, and how investments on the community side, not to suggest they're not happening, but we need to keep them under the radar. We need to keep them in focus because, not that we're going to go back to the way things were and go back to base housing. That's not the message here. But the message is, can we find a way to recreate that context such that it can feed the ongoing development and maintenance of individual and familial resiliency? Community, identity, belonging, and connection were just such richly profound themes coming out of these voices that it just made it ever more clear that we need to continually keep that interdependence between community and individual and familial resiliency in focus.
Excellent. So for policymakers, that's a very poignant piece of information.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. Yes, I think policymakers, while resiliency has kind of emerged as a focus that serves to complement some of the research, as we've learned in today's presentations, that rightly shines a light on some of the adverse effects of military service for families. Those stories exist, and they're not to be trivialized or diminished. But as so many of us believe, and has been shared today, there are other voices that can give a perspective on resiliency, even in the face of adversity. And from this study, I think it's warranting further examination of the ways in which the community factors into that. And I think, yes, you're right. Policymakers could be paying attention to that for sure.
Excellent. So we've again run out of time when I could have spent much more investigating and asking questions. Thank you very much. I'm very anxious to hear more and to read more about what you found out.
Thank you, Tamara.
Thank you. Okay, so moving on to our next presenter, Anne Cartier, presenting Rediscovering Equity in the Context of the Military Family Lifestyle, Conclusions of a Large Scope Gap Analysis of Programs and Services.
So good day. My name is Anne Chartier. I'm a Policy Development and Research Manager for the Canadian Forces Morale and Welfare Services. Today, I'm going to present you the result of my study called Reconsidering Equity in the Context of Military Family Lifestyle, Conclusion of a Large Scope Gap Analysis of Programs and Services. Next slide, please. I don't have any commercial support to disclose. Next, please. I don't have any potential bias to mitigate. And the learning objectives of the presentation is at the conclusion of it, participants will be able to explain the process that was used to conduct a large scope gap analysis with an equity lens, as well as the main finding of the study. Next, please. So in this presentation, I will present the context of the research, its objectives, the methods that were developed, its results, and the way we were able to validate the results. Next, please. So the present study was a requirement of the Comprehensive Military Family Plan, which is rooted in the defense policy that was launched in 2017. Stating that people are at the core of everything the Canadian Armed Forces does to deliver on its mandate, 28 initiatives were dedicated to people, amongst which 3 were specific to military families. The Initiative 24 requested the development of a comprehensive plan to better support families during operational absences, to increase relocation expertise, and to ease the process of relocation for families. To develop the plan, the team in place looked at existing research and conducted their own to obtain a good portrait of the needs of families. They also looked at CAF and families' demographics to know where they were and how they looked like, as well as conducted a program gap analysis to see if the programs in place were meeting the needs of these families, as there were very few evaluative research on the existing programs, either separately or as a whole. Today's presentation aims at sharing the process and some of the findings related to the gap analysis that was created and conducted for the development of the Comprehensive Military Family Plan. Next, please. So there were 3 main objectives of that research. As no large-scope program gap analysis process had been found in scientific literature, we had to create one that would allow to assess the distribution, the delivery, and the evaluation of the existing programs in the 32 CAF communities across Canada. And during the presentation, I will refer to these communities using the words locations. And the study also aimed to inform recommendations and action items to close the gaps that were identified. In the context of this presentation, I will use the word inequalities to describe differences or gaps that were observed, and I will use the word equity when these differences appear unfair. Next, please. The first step that we called the mapping was to make the inventory of all existing programs for military members and their family members. Based on the assumption that absences and relocation can impact most dimensions of human and family life, from the spiritual, emotional, physical, financial aspects, and so on, we looked at all programs and not just to those labeled as for relocation or absences. The inventory of all 200 programs included information on who the program was for instance, family member, group age, and their role within the family, such as caregiver, and where it was offered. Also, to which aspect of the military lifestyle each program aimed to have an impact on. Also on characteristics such as to which determinants of well-being, to which level of influence, and to where on the continuum of services each program belonged to. Regarding continuum of services, it refers to the suite of programs from awareness, promotion, prevention to intervention devoted to an issue for a specific population, such as mental health for youth. Using different models, we added strategy, surveillance, and coordination to that continuum as important means to support any continuum of services. The information was collected in tables in Excel, which allowed to generate figures and identify potential gaps and trends with regards to availability and alignment of programs that could impact awareness and self-agency of the members of the CAF community. Next, please. From the mapping, we could identify many inequalities in terms of program availability and alignment. But in order to assess if individually and collectively these programs were having an impact, we pushed the analysis further by looking at programs and other initiatives through specific frameworks such as program evaluation, Ottawa Charter for Health Promotion, collective impact, and the socio-ecological model. From the mapping and gap analysis, 26 systemic and 119 programming gaps were identified, which resulted in 18 general recommendations and 120 action items. By systemic gaps, we mean any disparities that are the result of policies, organizational structures, or practices. As for program gaps, they are breaks in continuum of services for certain segments of the population who do not receive the attention or services they need in spheres critical to their well-being. Next slide, please. So to summarize the 26 systemic gaps and the 119 programming gaps, we can say that at the systemic level, we noted that the focus was mainly on programs rather than on developing supportive environments, namely social, policy, or physical, which leads to a focus on individuals rather than family units or communities. We noted that there were no systematic or consistent program evaluation across Canadian Armed Forces, Canadian Forces Morale and Welfare Services, and Military Family Resources Centers. Also, we noted that there was no structure or backbone support to coordinate and bring together stakeholders, information, and research, to reconcile competing interests, and to operationalize the Family Covenant. In a nutshell, the CAF Family Covenant was released in 2008 by the Chief of the Defense Staff, General Natinchuk. The document acknowledges the critical role that military family members play in supporting serving members and has equity or fairness as its core principle, as military families should not be put at a disadvantage because their loved one has agreed to serve the nation. At the community level, family and individual levels, inequalities were identified within families, for instance, between spouses and also amongst families. Thus, the greatest inequalities between spouses were found in healthcare, mental health, and employment and professional development. As for inequalities amongst military families, geography was the greatest predictor of inequalities. It impacted program distribution across levels of influence, determinants of wellness, and continuum of services, creating inequalities between and within groups, family members, and communities. Many of these inequalities could also be qualified as iniquities, as many of them appeared unfair, could be mitigated or avoided, and could potentially disadvantage individuals, families, and communities. To illustrate the point, I'll use the example of geography. Next slide, please. So this graph shows the 32 locations we looked at from the most underserved to the most served and by level of influence. So we have programs that focused on individuals, family as a whole, and community. When we looked at the locations with the fewest number of programs and the one with the greatest number of programs, we could note a gap of 28% in number of programs at the individual level. Examples of such programs are the Health and Wellness Base and Wings Committee, Chaplaincy, PSP Community Recreation, or the Benefit Program, for instance. We could note also a gap of 35% in number of programs at the family as a whole level or family unit. Examples of such programs are Focus, Military Housing, and Intercom Program. Gap of 50% in number of programs at the community level. Such programs are Strongest Family Institute, Health Promotion Programs, iStep, and Kids Have Stress Too. So many of the locations that didn't meet at least one average were smaller communities that could not benefit from equivalent programs in the nearby municipality. On the other hand, the locations that were above the average number of programs were most often part or nearby an urban area which could offer a variety of programs for all family members. Next slide, please. Here we have three figures that show differences between three locations: Kingston, a well-served location; Gander, a medium to underserved location; and Dundurn, an underserved location. Based on the programs available in each location, the percentage expresses in which proportion the determinants of well-being were supporting each family member, who are each represented by a color. So from that, we can note that family members are not equally supported depending on where they are located. This difference in support could potentially be greater for family members with special needs or for those who don't speak the language of the service provider, for instance. In these three examples, the difference is most important for children, which are represented in gray. Next slide, please. Geography also had an impact on continuum of services. So taking the example of mental health programs for youth from the age of 6 to 12 years old, we have a table showing the different programs that are and that are not available in an underserved location. The yellow row representing the different types of programs, we can see that most educational and prevention programs were not offered. Some support programs were not offered, while some depended on staff capacity. Also, we can note that there were no campaign, policy, or strategy Canada-wide. Next slide, please. So we were able to validate the findings of the research and the whole process of the plan development in different ways. First, we conducted a gender-based analysis for the gap and the plan. GBA+ is a process used to assess how various groups of people may experience policies, programs, and initiatives differently. Second, we engaged up to 41 groups and stakeholders throughout the gap analysis and the plan development. These collaborators informed and provided feedback on the validity of the processes and specifically on the results of the gap analysis. Third, we developed a performance measurement framework of the whole plan to assess its scope, internal coherence, and its plausibility in achieving its desired outcomes. Here we have an example of one diagram that is part of the performance measurement framework. Taking an approach elaborated by Professor Lise Renaud in UQAM University, we made sure that the recommendations we made based on the gap analysis results were covering all levels of influence and means to achieve change. Next slide, please. So in conclusion, the mapping and gap analysis process allowed the identifications of several gaps, many of which were inequalities within and amongst families. Many of these inequalities resulted in inequities, but it is unclear how they are impacting individuals, family units, and communities. Though it seems that most of them could be avoided or mitigated by a greater focus on creating supportive policy, social, and physical environments, establishing common structures of coordination, developing joint strategies, and measuring and evaluating policies and programs in a systematic way. Finally, the processes, the findings, and the recommendations were all validated through a gender-based analysis plus, a systematic and exhaustive stakeholder engagement, and a performance measurement framework. Next slide, please. And here are the references used for this presentation. Thank you very much, and I welcome all questions.
Thank you very much, Anne. There's some really interesting information that I'm going to enjoy diving into later on with some very detailed reading. But we just have time probably for one question likely before we hit 1:30. But given the context of the conference that we're sitting within right now, do you think that the pandemic and moving into a more virtual settings has helped some of the gaps that were highlighted in what you found?
Yes, absolutely. As one of the general recommendations was to explore new modes of delivery for selected programs and services. So I can think how moving into more virtual settings could help children and youth, for example, who used to depend on their parents to attend in-person programs, for example, at PSP recreation program or programs at the MFRC. I can think also about people with disability or elderly parents that can have mobility issue that could be prevented from accessing certain buildings, for example, or military families who live in underserved locations that could potentially benefit from programs offered in better served locations. So definitely the pandemic, I think, had an impact on increasing accessibility of programs for families.
So, and next steps with the information that you found?
That's an interesting question, because the team that was formed for the comprehensive military family plan, we have all been redirected to our former positions. So we're no longer involved. The plan does not really has not been conducted necessarily, but I think they are for research definitely interesting piste de réflexion, like a path to look and explore. And I think one of them is how these gaps are really impacting families in health and wellness social outcomes, or how do they contribute to that. And I think that also that inequality or inequity piece between families and amongst families, how that can be explained. And I think we need a little bit more details. But I would assume that there might be some health outcomes that distinguishes military members and their families. But this is something to explore.
Excellent. Thank you very much. I really appreciated listening to your findings. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
You're welcome. So that brings us to the end of family session A. And I would very much like to pass you all on to Dr. David Pedler, Scientific Director for CIMVHR, for closing remarks.
So that wraps up day 3 of CIMVHR Virtual Forums oral presentations. Before we all continue with our day, I would like to encourage all students to visit the Student and Postdoctoral Engagement Committee webpage under the About Us section of the CIMVHR website. Our SPEC committee is growing, and we're looking for engaged students with a passion for military, veteran, family, and public safety personnel research to join the committee. Please take a look and learn more about this opportunity. Finally, I would like to pass along a huge thank you to Ms. Tamara Kleinschmidt and Lieutenant Colonel Andrew Beckett for doing an exceptional job on leading today's sessions as moderators. The CIMVHR team and I appreciate your dedication to the success of the forum. To the researchers who presented today, thank you for the time and effort you put into developing your presentations. It was an outstanding day of presentations. I look forward to seeing everyone next Thursday, October 28th, for day 4 of oral presentations that will focus on the public safety personnel and veterans. To all of you and your families, please stay safe and be well. Thank you.